Tonight's story is a quiet journey through history, made for you to simply listen to as you drift off to sleep. Julius Caesar is well known for his military conquests, his crossing of the Rubicon, and his dramatic rise to power in ancient Rome. But tonight, we'll take a deeper look at his story. First, turn the volume down a little. Then simply lie back, close your eyes, and make yourself comfortable. There is no need to follow every word. Just let the story drift quietly in the background, and if you fall asleep along the way, that is perfectly fine. And now, let tonight's story slowly begin. More than 2,000 years ago, long before the Roman Empire reached the height of its power, Rome was still officially a republic. It was already an enormous and influential state. Roman armies had crossed much of the Mediterranean world. Roman merchants traveled widely. Roman officials governed distant provinces. Wealth from conquest flowed toward the capital. And yet, beneath the strength and confidence of Rome, there were tensions. The Roman Republic had been designed centuries earlier for a much smaller city-state. As Roman territory expanded, the political system was required to manage responsibilities that its founders could hardly have imagined. There were disputes over land. There were struggles between wealthy aristocratic families and poorer citizens. There were rivalries between generals. There were arguments over who should control Rome's growing territories. And increasingly, successful military commanders discovered that soldiers could become loyal not simply to Rome, but to the generals who led them, rewarded them, and promised them land after years of service. Into this complicated world was born a boy named Gaius Julius Caesar. The traditional date given for his birth is July 12th or July 13th in the year 100 before the Common Era. Even something as simple as the exact day reminds us how distant this world is from our own. Records from ancient Rome do not always allow historians to answer every question with certainty. But the broad outline of Caesar's life is remarkably clear. He was born into the Julian family, an old patrician family of Rome. The Julii possessed an impressive ancestry. They claimed descent from Iulus, or Ascanius, the son of the Trojan hero Aeneas. And according to Roman legend, Aeneas himself was the son of the goddess Venus. So the Julian family could claim, at least in the language of Roman tradition, a connection not only to Rome's heroic past, but even to the divine world. This sounds extraordinarily grand. But Caesar's family, in his own lifetime, was not among the richest or most politically dominant families in Rome. They had an ancient name, but ancient names did not automatically produce unlimited wealth or influence. That distinction is important. Caesar did not begin life as an unknown outsider. He belonged to the Roman aristocracy. But neither did he simply inherit supreme power. The position he eventually reached would require decades of political maneuvering, alliances, military success, personal ambition, and extraordinary risk. His father was also named Gaius Julius Caesar. His mother was Aurelia, remembered in ancient accounts as a respected Roman woman. Through his father's family and through marriage connections, the young Caesar grew up close to the political conflicts that were shaking Rome. One particularly important connection came through his aunt Julia. She had married Gaius Marius. Marius was one of the most celebrated generals of his generation. He was also one of the central figures in the bitter political struggles of Caesar's youth. On the opposing side stood another powerful Roman commander, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius and Sulla had once cooperated. Eventually, they became bitter enemies. Their rivalry helped turn Roman political disagreement into armed conflict. Rome itself, the city that was supposed to govern an expanding republic, became a battlefield in struggles between Roman factions. For a young man growing up in this environment, politics could not have seemed like a distant or abstract subject. Politics could determine whether families prospered or disappeared. Politics could determine whether a man received an office or was forced into exile. And politics could sometimes determine whether a person lived at all. Caesar was still very young when these struggles reached their most dangerous stage. His father died when Caesar was around 16. Suddenly, the young man carried greater responsibility for his family. Around this period, Caesar married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna. Cinna was a political ally of Marius and an enemy of Sulla. The marriage therefore placed Caesar firmly within a network associated with Sulla's opponents. Then Sulla returned victorious. In 82 before the Common Era, Sulla emerged as the dominant figure in Rome. He became dictator and began reorganizing the republic. He also punished many of his political enemies. Caesar's connection to the defeated faction now became dangerous. According to the surviving tradition, Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia. Caesar refused. For someone still near the beginning of his adult life, it was a remarkable decision. He did not possess an army. He did not yet hold great political office. He was not yet the Caesar whose name would be known around the world. He was simply a young Roman aristocrat confronting the most powerful man in Rome. His refusal placed him in danger. Caesar temporarily left Rome and avoided Sulla's immediate reach. Family connections and influential supporters eventually helped secure his safety. But the experience must have taught him something about the nature of Roman politics. Power could change quickly. A celebrated leader could become an exile. An exile could return with an army. Old laws and traditions could bend under military pressure. And survival often depended upon relationships, reputation, and timing. Years later, Caesar himself would stand at the center of similar forces. But all of that was still far ahead. For now, he left Rome and began the part of his life that would introduce him to military service. Caesar's early military experience took him eastward. He served in Asia Minor, a region that had long been connected to the Greek world and was now increasingly tied to Roman power. During military operations at Mytilene, Caesar distinguished himself and received the civic crown, an important Roman military honor traditionally awarded for saving the life of a fellow citizen in battle. The young politician was learning how much prestige Rome gave to military achievement. In Roman public life, a successful military record could become much more than a personal accomplishment. It could become political capital. Victory brought recognition. Recognition brought influence. Influence could bring office, and office could lead to greater military command. This relationship between politics and military success would shape almost every stage of Caesar's later career. After Sulla's death in 78 before the Common Era, Caesar returned to Rome. He began building a reputation as an advocate and public speaker. Roman politics depended heavily on oratory. There were no modern microphones, television interviews, or social media messages. A politician had to speak before crowds, assemblies, judges, and fellow senators. Words mattered enormously. A Roman public figure needed to persuade. He needed to remember names and relationships. He needed to understand law. And he needed to create a public image that people would recognize. Caesar worked at these skills. He prosecuted prominent figures accused of misconduct. Even when he did not win every case, his speaking ability attracted attention. Wanting to improve his oratory further, he decided to travel to Rhodes, which was famous for advanced rhetorical training. It was during this journey that one of the most famous stories of Caesar's youth is said to have taken place. While crossing the Aegean Sea, Caesar was captured by pirates. The Mediterranean of the 1st century before the Common Era was not always safe. Piracy was a serious problem. Merchant ships, travelers, and even important Romans could become targets. According to later ancient accounts, the pirates demanded a ransom for Caesar. The story says that Caesar considered their first demand embarrassingly low. He supposedly told them that they did not understand whom they had captured and encouraged them to demand more. It is one of those stories that seems almost perfectly designed for the later image of Caesar: confident, proud, fearless, and perhaps slightly theatrical. Ancient writers also claimed that while he waited for the ransom, Caesar behaved less like a frightened prisoner and more like an impatient guest. He wrote, he exercised, he spoke to his captors, and he reportedly joked that once free, he would return and punish them. The ransom was eventually paid. Caesar was released. According to the traditional story, he then quickly organized forces, pursued the pirates, captured them, and had them executed. Modern historians treat some of the colorful details cautiously, because ancient biographers often shaped episodes to reveal the personality they believed a famous person possessed. Still, the pirate episode became one of the enduring stories about the young Caesar. Whether every conversation happened exactly as later writers described it, the story captures an important feature of his reputation. He did not like appearing powerless. When circumstances turned against him, he looked for a way to reverse them. After continuing his studies, Caesar returned again to political life. His progress would not be immediate. The Roman Republic had a carefully structured sequence of public offices. Ambitious men competed for them. A political career required patience, money, supporters, and good fortune. Caesar would need all four. Roman politics was intensely personal. Families mattered. Marriages mattered. Friendships mattered. Debts mattered. public generosity mattered, and reputation mattered perhaps more than anything. Caesar gradually advanced through the Roman political system. He served as a military tribune. Later, he became quaestor. The quaestorship was an important early step in the traditional Roman political career. It gave a young aristocrat administrative experience and placed him firmly within public life. Around the same period, Caesar's wife Cornelia died. Their marriage had produced a daughter, Julia. Julia would later become extraordinarily important in Caesar's political alliances, although perhaps through circumstances that neither father nor daughter could have predicted at the time. Caesar later married Pompeia, a granddaughter of Sulla. The marriage itself shows how fluid Roman aristocratic politics could be. Only a few years earlier, Caesar had risked Sulla's anger by refusing to abandon Cornelia. Now, after Sulla's death, Caesar could marry into Sulla's own family. Politics created enemies. Politics could also rearrange them. In 65 before the Common Era, Caesar became an aedile. Among an aedile's responsibilities were public buildings, festivals, and games. Caesar spent heavily. The spectacles he sponsored increased his popularity with ordinary Romans. They also increased his debts. This pattern would follow him for years. He spent money to build political support. Financial supporters helped him continue his career. Greater office brought greater opportunities. Caesar was ambitious enough to take risks that might have ruined a less determined politician. Among the people who became important to him was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was enormously wealthy. He had also achieved military and political prominence. His financial resources made him one of the most influential individuals in Rome. Another increasingly important figure was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. We normally know him as Pompey the Great. Pompey was already one of Rome's most celebrated commanders. He had won important campaigns and enjoyed tremendous prestige. Crassus and Pompey were not natural friends. In fact, they were rivals. Caesar's ability to cooperate with both would eventually become one of the foundations of his rise. Before that alliance fully developed, however, Caesar achieved one of the most remarkable political victories of his early career. He sought election as Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. The position was prestigious and carried considerable influence. Caesar faced older and highly respected competitors. He nevertheless won. The victory showed that his political network had become powerful. It also gave him a position that he would hold for the rest of his life. Ancient Roman religion and Roman politics were deeply connected. Priests participated in public ceremonies. The interpretation of religious signs could affect political business. Calendars, festivals, elections, war, and public office all existed within a world in which religion formed part of civic life. For a modern listener, it may be difficult to separate the sacred from the political in ancient Rome, because Romans themselves often did not separate them in the way we might today. Caesar now stood at the center of both. His domestic life, however, again became the subject of public controversy. A religious festival known as the Bona Dea was held at Caesar's residence. Men were excluded from the ceremony. A young aristocrat named Publius Clodius Pulcher was accused of entering the event disguised as a woman. The incident became a scandal. Questions arose about Caesar's wife Pompeia and whether she had been involved. Caesar divorced her. Later tradition connected the episode to the idea that Caesar's wife had to be above suspicion. Whatever the exact words spoken at the time, the marriage was over. Caesar continued upward. He became praetor. Then he served as governor in further Spain. Provincial governorship offered opportunities for military command, administration, prestige, and wealth. Caesar conducted successful campaigns there. His victories brought him the possibility of celebrating a triumph in Rome. A Roman triumph was one of the greatest honors available to a commander. A victorious general could enter the city in a magnificent ceremonial procession. Soldiers marched. Captives might be displayed. Spoils of war appeared before the crowd. The general rode at the center of the celebration. For an ambitious Roman, a triumph represented military glory made visible. But Caesar faced a problem. He also wanted to stand for election as consul. To celebrate the triumph properly, he would need to remain outside Rome until the ceremony. To become a candidate for consul under the normal procedure, he needed to enter the city. Caesar chose the consulship. It was a choice that tells us much about him. A triumph would celebrate what he had already accomplished. The consulship could give him the power to accomplish much more. And so, in 60 before the Common Era, Caesar prepared for one of the decisive political arrangements of Roman history. 3 men now stood near the center of Roman public life. Pompey was the famous commander. Crassus possessed enormous wealth. Caesar had ambition, political skill, and a growing popular following. Each man had problems that the normal political system was not solving for him. Pompey wanted arrangements he had made in Rome's eastern territories to be confirmed. He also wanted land for his veterans. Crassus had financial interests and clients who wanted favorable political decisions. Caesar wanted the consulship and the power necessary to advance his own career. Individually, each man faced opposition. Together, they might overcome it. The arrangement that emerged is traditionally called the First Triumvirate. The name can be slightly misleading because it was not a formal 3-man constitutional office. It was an informal political alliance. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus agreed to cooperate. Their combined resources were formidable. Caesar also strengthened his connection with Pompey by arranging for his daughter Julia to marry him. The marriage was political, but ancient accounts suggest that Pompey and Julia developed genuine affection for one another. For a time, the alliance worked. Caesar won election as consul for the year 59 before the Common Era. The consulship was one of Rome's highest regular offices. 2 consuls served together. In theory, each could limit the other. Caesar's fellow consul was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a conservative opponent. Their relationship was difficult. Caesar pushed measures that benefited Pompey's veterans and his political allies. He proposed land legislation. He worked to confirm Pompey's eastern arrangements. He helped address issues important to Crassus. Political conflict became intense. Roman politics had never been a quiet profession, but the struggles of these years increasingly tested the conventions that were supposed to keep competition within established boundaries. For Caesar, the most important question was what would happen after his year as consul ended. Former consuls often received provincial commands. Such commands could provide armies. Armies provided security. Military success provided prestige, and prestige would protect Caesar's political future. Caesar received command in Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and eventually Transalpine Gaul. This placed him in charge of territory extending from northern Italy toward regions beyond Rome's direct control. He would remain away from Rome for years. When he left the city, he was already a major political figure. When he eventually returned toward Italy at the head of an army, he would be something far greater. The transformation took place in Gaul. The word Gaul referred to a broad region rather than a single unified country. Much of modern France lay within it, as did parts of Belgium, Switzerland, and neighboring areas. The people whom Romans called Gauls belonged to many different tribes and communities. They did not all share a single government. They did not always cooperate with one another. Some had existing relationships with Rome. Some traded with Romans. Some feared neighboring peoples more than they feared Roman expansion. This complicated political landscape gave Caesar opportunities. In 58 before the Common Era, a people called the Helvetii began a large migration. They intended to move westward. Caesar presented their movement as a threat to Roman interests. He blocked one route and eventually fought them. The campaign ended in Roman victory, but Caesar did not simply return to his province. Another conflict followed. A Germanic leader named Ariovistus had established power west of the Rhine. Caesar confronted him. Again, Caesar won. Within a relatively short time, 2 successful campaigns had changed his position. His soldiers had experience. His reputation in Rome grew. His command now had momentum. The following year, Caesar turned his attention northward. He fought a coalition of peoples whom Romans called the Belgae. The campaigns were difficult. At the river Sabus, Caesar's forces faced a sudden and dangerous attack by the Nervi and their allies. According to Caesar's own account, the Roman situation became extremely serious. The battle eventually turned in his favor. Another Roman victory followed. We should remember that much of what we know about these campaigns comes from Caesar himself. He wrote the commentaries on the Gallic War. These works are among the most famous surviving pieces of Latin prose. Caesar generally refers to himself in the third person. The style can appear calm and factual. Events unfold with apparent clarity. Difficult decisions seem necessary. Roman victories often appear as the logical result of discipline and leadership. But Caesar was not merely recording history. He was also a politician, writing about his own controversial military command. His readers included Romans. His reputation mattered. His version of events, therefore, needs to be read with care. This does not mean that the commentaries are useless. Far from it. They are an extraordinary source. But like any source written by a participant, particularly a participant with enormous political ambitions, they tell us both about events and about how the writer wanted those events to be understood. For a quiet moment, imagine Caesar during these years, not only commanding armies, but also shaping the story of those armies. Military action happened far from Rome. The written account carried his achievements back toward the capital. In a world without instant communication, reputation still traveled. Members arrived. Political allies repeated news. Thanksgivings were voted. Stories of victories circulated. Caesar was physically distant from Rome, but politically he never stopped thinking about it. His campaigns continued. In 56 before the Common Era, Roman forces fought the Veneti, a maritime people of the Atlantic coast. The Romans were experienced on the Mediterranean, but Atlantic conditions were different. Tides were stronger. The coast was unfamiliar. The Veneti had capable ships suited to local waters. Rome nevertheless defeated them. Caesar's treatment of defeated opponents could be harsh. The Gallic Wars were not an adventure story. They involved conquest, destruction, enslavement, and enormous human suffering. Ancient sources give very large numbers for casualties and captives, although historians do not simply accept every ancient figure as exact. For a sleep-oriented history, there is no need to linger on graphic details. But neither should the reality be hidden. Caesar's fame was built in part upon war. His victories created prestige for him and expanded Roman domination. For many of the communities that faced his armies, the experience was devastating. This tension is essential to understanding Caesar. The brilliant commander celebrated in Roman tradition was also a conqueror whose campaigns transformed the lives of millions of people. History can hold both truths at the same time. By the middle of the Gallic campaigns, Caesar's alliance with Pompey and Crassus also required attention. The three men had cooperated, but political alliances rarely remain unchanged forever. In 56 before the Common Era, they renewed their arrangement at a meeting traditionally associated with Lucca. The political bargain extended Caesar's command. Pompey and Crassus also received important provincial positions. For the moment, the partnership survived. Caesar now had additional years in which to continue his campaigns. In 55 before the Common Era, he turned toward the Rhine. Germanic peoples beyond the river existed outside Roman control. Caesar decided to cross. Instead of simply using boats, his army constructed a bridge across the Rhine. The engineering achievement carried a political message as well as a military one. The river did not have to be an absolute boundary. Roman soldiers could cross it. Roman engineering could overcome it. Caesar advanced across the river and then returned. The bridge was not simply infrastructure, it was a demonstration. That same year, Caesar looked in another direction. Across the English Channel lay Britain. Romans knew of the island. Trade existed between Britain and the continent. Some British communities had connections with peoples in Gaul, but no Roman commander had yet launched a campaign there on the scale Caesar attempted. He crossed the Channel. The first expedition achieved limited results. Weather, unfamiliar conditions, and logistical problems made operations difficult. Caesar returned to Gaul. The following year, 54 before the Common Era, he tried again with a much larger force. The Romans moved inland and fought British resistance. Caesar established political agreements with some local rulers before returning to the continent. He had not conquered Britain. Permanent Roman conquest would come almost a century later, during the reign of Emperor Claudius. But Caesar's expeditions added greatly to his fame. To Roman audiences, Britain lay near the edge of the known world. The fact that Caesar had crossed the sea to reach it gave his campaigns an almost legendary quality. And yet, while he was reaching outward geographically, his political foundation was becoming less secure. His daughter Julia died in 54 before the Common Era. She had been the wife of Pompey. Her death removed an important personal connection between the two men. Older accounts sometimes describe her death as the moment that broke the alliance between Caesar and Pompey. Modern historians tend to be more cautious. Their cooperation did not immediately collapse, but a bond was gone. Then, in 53 before the Common Era, Crassus was killed during a disastrous Roman campaign against the Parthian Empire at Carrhae. The three-man alliance had lost one of its members. Now there were two, Caesar and Pompey. Two enormously ambitious men. Two famous commanders. Two political networks. And increasingly, one Roman political system that seemed unable to contain their rivalry. Before that rivalry became open civil war, however, Caesar faced the greatest challenge of his campaigns in Gaul. Years of Roman victories had not created universal acceptance of Roman rule. In 52 before the Common Era, a major Gallic revolt began. At its center was a leader named Vercingetorix. He came from the Arverni and succeeded in bringing together a broad coalition against Caesar. This was no small local rebellion. It threatened much of what Caesar had accomplished. Vercingetorix understood that fighting Rome in direct conventional battles could be dangerous. Roman legions were disciplined. They were trained to move, build camps, dig fortifications, and fight as coordinated units. So the Gallic strategy included denying supplies to Caesar. Settlements and food stores that might help the Romans could be destroyed before Roman forces arrived. It was a painful strategy because it required communities to sacrifice their own property. But the purpose was clear. An army cannot survive without food. Caesar attacked Avaricum, a major fortified settlement. After a difficult siege, the Romans captured it. Later, however, Caesar suffered a setback at Gergovia. The Romans did not win every battle. The defeat reminded both sides that Caesar was not invincible. Vercingetorix still had an army. The rebellion remained dangerous. Eventually, Vercingetorix withdrew into the fortified settlement of Alesia, and there Caesar undertook one of the most famous siege operations in ancient military history. Alesia stood in a strong defensive position. Vercingetorix and his forces were inside. Caesar's army surrounded them. But there was a problem. A large Gallic relief army might arrive from outside. If that happened, Caesar could be trapped between two enemies. His solution was extraordinary. Roman soldiers built one line of fortifications facing inward toward Alesia. Then they built another line facing outward. The Romans were effectively creating a fortified ring around themselves. Inside the ring was Vercingetorix. Outside it, a relief army eventually appeared. Caesar's troops would have to defend in two directions. For days, the pressure increased. Attacks came from the fortress. Attacks came from outside. At moments, the Roman position became extremely dangerous. But the defenses held. The relief effort failed. Vercingetorix eventually surrendered. Later artistic traditions created dramatic images of the Gallic leader riding out proudly to place his weapons before Caesar. The exact visual details are less certain than the basic outcome. Alesia was a decisive Roman victory. The organized revolt was broken. Further operations continued afterward, but Caesar's conquest of Gaul was largely secure. The consequences were enormous. Roman power now extended far beyond its former frontier. The resources and communities of Gaul became increasingly connected to the Roman world. Over time, Roman roads, towns, law, language, and institutions would reshape the region. The process was neither immediate nor simple. Local cultures did not simply disappear, but Gaul became one of the most important parts of the Roman state. For Caesar personally, the consequences were equally important. He had commanded armies for years. His soldiers had followed him through repeated campaigns. They had crossed rivers, mountains, and seas. They had endured winters, sieges, marches, and battles. Many were deeply loyal to him. Caesar had wealth from conquest. He had military prestige on a scale few Roman politicians could match. And he had an army. In Rome, that combination created fear. The question was no longer whether Caesar was important. The question was, what would happen when his command ended? Roman politics had become increasingly unstable during Caesar's years in Gaul. Violence in the streets was not unknown. Political factions struggled for control. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, gradually moved closer to the senatorial leaders who feared Caesar's power. Caesar faced a serious legal and political problem. While he held provincial command, he enjoyed protections connected with office. If he returned to Rome as a private citizen before securing another magistracy, his enemies could prosecute him. His opponents wanted him to surrender his command. Caesar wanted to stand for another consulship without first becoming politically vulnerable. Negotiations followed. Various compromises were discussed. Could Caesar and Pompey both give up their extraordinary commands? Could Caesar retain part of his army until the election? Could both sides step away from confrontation? For a time, civil war was not inevitable. People were still negotiating. Cicero and others hoped for compromise. But trust was disappearing. Each side feared what the other might do if it surrendered first. That is one of the tragic patterns that appears repeatedly in history. Two sides may both understand that conflict will be destructive, yet each may believe that yielding creates an even greater danger. Eventually, the political system reached its breaking point. In early January of 49 before the Common Era, Caesar received news that his opponents had prevailed in Rome. The Senate demanded that he surrender his command. Tribunes friendly to Caesar fled the city. Caesar now had to choose. He could obey, he could dismiss his soldiers and return to Rome without an army, or he could enter Italy under arms. The boundary of his province was marked by a small river called the Rubicon. Today, the phrase "crossing the Rubicon" means taking an irreversible step. The expression comes from what Caesar did next. He crossed the river with troops. Ancient sources later associated the moment with the words often translated as, "The die is cast." We cannot know exactly what Caesar said beside that river, if he said anything at all. The later literary tradition shaped the scene into a perfect dramatic moment. But the action itself required no dramatic words. A Roman provincial commander was bringing troops into Italy without authorization. The political dispute had become civil war. Caesar moved quickly south. Cities opened their gates. Opposing forces withdrew. Pompey and many senators concluded that they could not defend Italy immediately. They crossed the Adriatic to Greece, where Pompey could draw upon the enormous resources and political connections he had developed during his earlier eastern campaigns. Caesar entered Rome. The city had not fallen after a great battle. There was no long siege. Pompey had left. Caesar was now physically in control of the capital, but the war was only beginning. Caesar faced a strategic problem. Pompey was in the east gathering forces, but Pompeian armies also existed in Spain. Caesar could not safely march east while leaving powerful enemies behind him in the west. So he moved first toward Spain. The campaign demonstrated one of Caesar's most consistent strengths: speed. Again and again, his enemies had difficulty predicting how quickly he could move. Roman armies could cover impressive distances when disciplined, supplied, and determined. Caesar's Spanish campaign ended with the surrender of opposing forces. He often emphasized clemency toward defeated Romans. This was politically useful. Civil war was different from foreign conquest. If Caesar treated every Roman opponent as an enemy to be destroyed, resistance might become more desperate. If he pardoned opponents, some might accept his victory and return to public life. Clemency, therefore, became part of Caesar's political identity. It was genuine in many cases. It was also strategic. Men who had fought against him could later become senators, officials, and even associates of his government. Some would eventually participate in the conspiracy against him. After securing his western position, Caesar turned east toward Pompey. The campaign in Greece was dangerous. Pompey possessed larger resources. Caesar crossed the Adriatic with only part of his army because he lacked enough ships to move everyone at once. He found himself separated from reinforcements. At Dyrrhachium, Caesar attempted to contain Pompey's army with extensive fortifications. The situation became difficult. Pompey broke through. Caesar suffered a serious defeat. For perhaps one of the most important moments in the entire civil war, Pompey had an opportunity. Caesar withdrew. He later suggested that his enemies could have won the war if they had understood how to use their victory. Whether that judgment is entirely fair to Pompey is another question. But Caesar survived the setback. The two armies moved into Thessaly. There, near Pharsalus, they met again in 48 before the Common Era. Pompey's army was larger, particularly in cavalry. The Pompeian plan relied heavily on that cavalry to overwhelm Caesar's flank. Caesar anticipated the danger. He positioned additional infantry behind his cavalry line. When Pompey's cavalry advanced and drove Caesar's horsemen back, these hidden or specially positioned infantry forces attacked. The Pompeian cavalry broke. Caesar's forces struck the exposed flank. The battle became a decisive victory for Caesar. Pompey fled. For Romans watching these events, the transformation must have been astonishing. Pompey the Great had spent decades building a reputation as one of Rome's greatest commanders. He had defeated pirates across the Mediterranean. He had campaigned successfully in the East. He had reorganized territories. He had celebrated extraordinary triumphs. Now, he was a fugitive. Caesar, once his junior political partner and father-in-law, had defeated him. Pompey traveled to Egypt. He hoped to find support there. Instead, the advisors of the young Egyptian king Ptolemy XIII decided that receiving Pompey might anger the victorious Caesar. As Pompey came ashore, he was killed. The civil war had produced one of its most remarkable reversals. The man who had once been among the most powerful individuals in the Mediterranean world died far from Rome while seeking refuge. Soon afterward, Caesar arrived in Egypt. The Egyptians expected that Pompey's death might please him. According to the surviving accounts, it did not. Caesar had fought Pompey, but Pompey was also a Roman consul, a celebrated general, and once Caesar's ally and family connection. Their rivalry belonged to Roman politics. The manner of his death was another matter. And now, unexpectedly, Caesar found himself drawn into the politics of Egypt. Egypt was one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean world. Its agricultural wealth depended on the Nile. Its ancient traditions reached back thousands of years before Caesar. Its capital, Alexandria, was one of the great cities of the ancient world. Founded by Alexander the Great, Alexandria was a center of trade, scholarship, royal power, and Greek culture. The kingdom was ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander's generals. When Caesar arrived, that dynasty was divided. Ptolemy XIII and his older sister Cleopatra VII were rivals for power. They had formerly shared the throne, but their relationship had broken down. Cleopatra had been forced away from Alexandria. Caesar entered this conflict partly because Egypt owed Rome large sums of money, and because Roman interests were already involved in the succession dispute. Cleopatra sought an audience with him. Later stories describe her being secretly carried into Caesar's presence, concealed in bedding or a sack. The familiar image of Cleopatra being unrolled from a carpet comes largely from later retellings. The exact method of her arrival is less important than what followed. Cleopatra and Caesar formed an alliance. They also became lovers. Caesar supported her claim against Ptolemy. The political dispute became a war in Alexandria. Caesar's position was dangerous. He had arrived with relatively limited forces. Fighting took place in and around the city. Part of the conflict affected Alexandria's harbor area, and ancient accounts later connected a fire during the fighting with damage to collections of books. Although the history of the famous Library of Alexandria is much more complicated than the simple story that Caesar destroyed the entire library. Eventually, reinforcements arrived. Ptolemy XIII was defeated and died during the conflict. Cleopatra was restored to power. She ruled with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. Caesar remained in Egypt for a time. Cleopatra later gave birth to a son known as Caesarion, or Little Caesar. Cleopatra presented him as Caesar's son. Ancient and modern discussions have debated Caesar's recognition of the child. What is clear is that Caesar did not make Caesarion his Roman political heir. That role would eventually belong to another young relative, Octavian. But Octavian's importance still lay in the future. For now, Caesar had another war to fight. While Caesar had been occupied in Egypt, problems had developed elsewhere. In Asia Minor, Pharnaces II, the ruler of the Bosporan kingdom and son of Rome's old enemy Mithridates VI, had taken advantage of Roman civil conflict to expand his position. Caesar moved rapidly to confront him. The campaign ended quickly at the Battle of Sulla in 47 before the Common Era. Caesar's victory became associated with three of the most famous Latin words in history: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The phrase captured the speed of the victory, and it perfectly suited Caesar's public image: direct, confident, efficient. But once again, victory abroad did not end the Roman Civil War. Pompey was dead, yet Pompey's cause survived. Senatorial opponents gathered in North Africa. Among them was Cato the Younger, one of Caesar's most determined political opponents. Cato represented, for later generations, a fierce commitment to republican principle. Caesar went to Africa. In 46 before the Common Era, his forces defeated the opposing army at Thapsus. Cato was in Utica. Rather than accept Caesar's pardon, he chose to die by suicide. His death had powerful symbolic consequences. Caesar had promoted clemency, but clemency required the defeated person to accept the victor's authority. Cato refused to do that. By choosing death rather than pardon, he denied Caesar the role of merciful conqueror. Later opponents of autocratic government would remember Cato as a symbol of republican resistance. The war continued once more. Pompey's sons and other commanders gathered strength in Spain. Caesar traveled there for what would become his final major campaign. At Munda in 45 before the Common Era, the fighting was difficult. Caesar won. One of Pompey's sons, Gnaeus, was later killed. Another, Sextus Pompey, escaped and would continue to play a role in Roman conflict for years. But for Caesar, the great civil war was effectively over. Gaul had been conquered. Pompey was dead. The senatorial armies had been defeated. Caesar stood without an equal military rival. And so he returned to Rome. The central question of his life changed. For years, the question had been whether Caesar could gain power. Now the question was what he would do with it. Caesar's position after the Civil War did not fit comfortably within the old traditions of the Republic. Rome still had consuls, it still had a senate, it still had assemblies. Traditional magistracies continued, but Caesar possessed authority far beyond that of an ordinary elected official. He was repeatedly appointed dictator. The Roman dictatorship was an old constitutional office. Traditionally, a dictator was appointed temporarily during an emergency. The office itself was not new. What was unusual was the duration and concentration of Caesar's authority. In 46 before the Common Era, he received a dictatorship for 10 years. Then, in early 44 before the Common Era, he was named Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator in Perpetuity, or Dictator for Life. To Romans deeply suspicious of kingship, the title was alarming. Rome's political culture contained a powerful traditional story. Centuries earlier, Romans believed that they had expelled their last king and created the Republic. The rejection of kingship became part of Roman identity. Roman politicians could accumulate enormous influence. Generals could receive extraordinary commands. But openly becoming king was something different. Caesar never formally took the title Rex, king. Still, many senators wondered what distinction remained if one man held power permanently. Supporters saw stability. Opponents saw monarchy in everything but name. Caesar began an ambitious program of reform. One of his most enduring achievements involved something so familiar that we rarely stop to think about its ancient origins: the calendar. The old Roman calendar had become badly misaligned with the solar year. Political manipulation and irregular adjustments had contributed to the confusion. Caesar introduced a major reform with assistance from astronomical knowledge associated with Alexandria, traditionally connected with the scholar Sosigenes. The new system created a year of approximately 365 and 1/4 days. Most years had 365 days. An additional day was added periodically. The Julian calendar took effect in 45 before the Common Era. It was not identical to the calendar most of the world uses today. Centuries later, the Gregorian reform adjusted a small remaining error. But the structure of our familiar year owes a great deal to Caesar's reform. Months passing in regular sequence, a leap year principle, a calendar tied much more closely to the solar year. It is one of the quieter parts of Caesar's legacy. Armies vanish, political alliances disappear, ancient speeches are forgotten. Yet every time we move through a calendar descended from that system, we are living with an echo of decisions made in Caesar's Rome. Even the month of July carries his name. The Roman month Quintilis was renamed Julius in Caesar's honor. Later, Sextilis would become Augustus, honoring his successor. July and August, therefore, preserve two names from the transformation of the Roman world more than 2,000 years ago. Caesar also addressed debt. Civil war had disrupted the economy. Rather than simply canceling all debts, he introduced measures intended to reduce the burden while preserving much of the existing financial structure. He reorganized elements of local government. He reduced the number of people receiving subsidized grain in Rome. He established colonies and settled veterans and other citizens in communities outside Italy. He planned major public works. He expanded the Senate substantially. This enlargement allowed him to bring in supporters and men from communities that had previously enjoyed less representation at the center of Roman politics. Critics complained that the Senate's prestige was being weakened. Supporters could argue that Rome's governing class needed to reflect a much larger Roman world. Caesar also extended Roman citizenship to additional communities. These policies pointed toward a future in which Rome would become less exclusively a city governing outsiders and more a political system incorporating elites from across its territories. Later emperors would take that process much further. Caesar did not have time. His period of undisputed supremacy was surprisingly short. When we think of Julius Caesar, it can feel as though he ruled Rome for a long age. In reality, his dominance after the final civil war was brief. He had spent decades climbing, years campaigning, years fighting civil war, but only a comparatively short period controlling Rome without a major military rival. And throughout that period, questions about the nature of his power grew louder. Honors accumulated around Caesar. His image appeared on Roman coins during his lifetime, an extraordinary development in the Roman Republic. He was granted special clothing and ceremonial privileges. A statue of him could stand among those of kings. His seat in public institutions could be distinguished from others. His birthday received public recognition. The Senate voted honors faster than later observers can easily separate Caesar's own wishes from the enthusiasm, fear, or flattery of those proposing them. Some senators may have genuinely admired him. Some may have hoped to gain favor. Some may have supported excessive honors precisely because they made Caesar appear more obviously monarchical. We cannot always know their intentions. Caesar himself could sometimes seem impatient with traditional ceremony. One episode became especially damaging to his image among the senatorial class. When a group of senators came to present honors to him, Caesar remained seated rather than rising to greet them. Ancient sources offer explanations. Perhaps he was physically unwell. Perhaps he misunderstood the situation. Perhaps he intended to emphasize his superiority. Whatever the reason, the symbolism mattered. Roman senators were intensely sensitive to status. A man who remained seated while the Senate approached him could appear less like a republican magistrate and more like a monarch receiving subjects. Another incident involved Mark Antony. Antony had become one of Caesar's important supporters. During the festival of the Lupercalia in February of 44 before the Common Era, Antony publicly offered Caesar a diadem, a symbol associated with monarchy. Caesar refused it. The crowd responded approvingly to the refusal. Antony offered again. Caesar refused again. The episode is difficult to interpret with certainty. Was it spontaneous? Was it staged to demonstrate that Caesar did not want the title of king? Was someone testing public opinion? Ancient observers themselves disagreed. What mattered politically was that the subject of kingship was now impossible to ignore. Rumors circulated that Caesar might be called king outside Italy. A Parthian campaign was being prepared. There was an old belief, according to some accounts, that only a king could conquer Parthia. Whether Caesar intended anything resembling a hereditary monarchy is uncertain. We know that his position was extraordinary. We know that he accepted the title Dictator Perpetuo. We know that he accumulated honors unprecedented in the Republic. But Caesar did not live long enough to show how his political system might have developed. And this uncertainty frightened some senators. They did not want to wait and find out. A conspiracy began to form. The participants were not all identical in motive. Some had fought against Caesar in the Civil War. Some had accepted his pardon. Some had benefited from his government. Some believed they were defending republican liberty. Some may have had personal resentments. Some objected to Caesar's honors. Some feared what he might become. At the center of the conspiracy were Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus is the name most widely remembered today. Part of that fame comes from later literature, especially Shakespeare. But the historical Brutus was already a significant Roman aristocrat. His family name carried powerful republican associations. Tradition claimed that an earlier Lucius Junius Brutus had helped expel Rome's kings centuries before. Whether every detail of that early story was historical did not matter to Roman political imagination. The name Brutus was associated with resistance to kingship. Marcus Brutus had originally supported Pompey during the Civil War. After Pompey's defeat, Caesar pardoned him.
Brutus returned to public life and received offices under Caesar. His mother, Servilia, had also had a long personal relationship with Caesar. This web of political and personal connections makes the conspiracy more complicated than a simple story of friends and enemies. Roman aristocratic society was small enough that opponents were often relatives, former allies, or people who had dined together. Civil war divided people who knew one another. Reconciliation brought them back into the same political spaces. Suspicion never entirely disappeared. The conspirators called themselves liberatores, liberators. They believed, or at least publicly claimed, that killing Caesar would free Rome from tyranny and restore the Republic. Their plan faced a deadline. Caesar was preparing to leave Rome for a major campaign against Parthia. The departure was planned for March. Once Caesar left with his armies, assassinating him would become much more difficult. So the conspirators chose a Senate meeting. The date was March 15th, the Ides of March. The Roman calendar divided months differently from the way we normally speak of dates today. The Ides fell near the middle of the month. For March, the Ides was the 15th. Because of Caesar's death, the phrase would become one of the most famous dates in history. Later traditions surrounded the day with warnings and omens. Ancient writers loved signs before the deaths of famous people. Dreams, strange animals, unusual weather, prophecies, and the story of Caesar attracted many of them. A soothsayer named Spurinna was said to have warned Caesar of danger associated with the Ides of March. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, was said to have experienced disturbing dreams. Stories claimed that Caesar considered staying home. Some accounts describe Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, one of the conspirators and a man Caesar trusted, persuading him to attend. It is impossible to know how many of these details occurred exactly as later writers described them. When a famous person dies dramatically, memory tends to organize earlier events into signs that seem obvious afterward. People wonder whether the disaster could have been avoided. They remember warnings. They create a sense of approaching destiny. The historian has to separate that later dramatic shape from what can actually be known. What we can say is simpler. Caesar attended the Senate meeting on March 15, 44, before the Common Era. The Senate was not meeting in its usual chamber because construction work was taking place. Instead, senators gathered in a hall connected with the theater of Pompey. The location carried an extraordinary irony. Caesar had defeated Pompey. Pompey was dead. Yet the building complex created by Pompey would become the setting of Caesar's own death. The conspirators gathered around him. One approached with a petition. Then the attack began. Caesar was surrounded and killed by the group of senators. Ancient accounts say that he received many wounds. There is no need to dwell on the violence itself. The political meaning of the event is more important than its physical details. A man who had survived decades of Roman conflict, distant campaigns, sieges, civil war, and dangerous journeys, died in the center of Rome among members of the Senate. He was 55 years old. The famous line, "Et tu, Brute?" is known around the world because of Shakespeare.
It should not be treated as Caesar's securely documented last words. Ancient sources preserve different traditions. Some suggest that he said nothing. Another reports Greek words that can be translated as something like, "You too, child?" We simply do not know. And perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate. History often gives us the consequences of a moment more clearly than its final words. What happened next is certain enough. The conspirators had killed Caesar, but they had not solved Rome's political crisis. The liberators expected, or at least hoped, that Romans would see Caesar's death as the restoration of freedom. But removing a ruler is not the same thing as rebuilding a political system. Caesar had supporters. He had veterans. He had officials appointed under his government. He had a popular following among many ordinary Romans. And he had a will. Mark Antony, who was serving as consul, survived. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, another Caesar supporter, had troops nearby. The conspirators did not immediately gain control of the city. A tense compromise emerged. Caesar's acts would remain valid. The assassins were not immediately punished. For a moment, Rome seemed suspended between competing possibilities. Then came Caesar's funeral. Ancient accounts describe strong public emotion. A crowd gathered. Anger toward the conspirators increased. The political atmosphere became dangerous enough that Brutus and Cassius eventually left Rome. And then Caesar's will revealed a surprise. The principal heir was not Mark Antony. It was a young man named Gaius Octavius. Octavius was Caesar's great-nephew through Caesar's sister's family. He was only 18 years old. Caesar had adopted him in his will. The young heir now took Caesar's name. He became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus in conventional historical terminology, although contemporaries would have thought of the naming somewhat differently. Today, historians normally call him Octavian when speaking about the years before he received the title Augustus. At first glance, an 18-year-old might not have seemed like the greatest threat in Rome. Antony was an experienced politician and soldier. Brutus and Cassius were respected aristocrats. Lepidus commanded troops. Many other powerful men had armies, wealth, and connections. But Octavian possessed something unusual: Caesar's name and Caesar's inheritance. He arrived in Italy and began the patient, ruthless, and extraordinarily successful process of turning that inheritance into power. The struggles that followed were complicated. Alliances shifted. Antony and Octavian first became rivals. Then they cooperated. Along with Lepidus, they formed the political arrangement known as the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the earlier informal alliance of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this Second Triumvirate received formal legal authority. Its methods were harsh. Enemies were proscribed. Cicero, one of Rome's greatest speakers and writers, was killed. Brutus and Cassius gathered armies in the east. In 42 before the Common Era, their forces met those of Antony and Octavian at Philippi. Brutus and Cassius were defeated. Both died.
The men who had killed Caesar in the name of restoring the Republic were gone. But the Republic they hoped to restore did not return. Instead, new conflicts followed among Caesar's successors. Eventually, the struggle narrowed primarily to Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. Antony formed both a political and personal partnership with Cleopatra of Egypt. The same Cleopatra who had once been Caesar's ally and lover was now connected to Caesar's former lieutenant. Once again, Roman politics and Egyptian royal politics became intertwined. In 31 before the Common Era, Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. The following year, both Antony and Cleopatra died. Octavian became the unchallenged master of the Roman world. In 27 before the Common Era, the Senate granted him the title Augustus. It is from Augustus that historians normally date the Roman Empire and the beginning of Rome's imperial system. This distinction matters. Julius Caesar was not emperor in the later constitutional sense, in which Augustus is considered Rome's first emperor. Caesar remained formally a dictator of the Roman Republic. Yet without Caesar, the rise of Augustus is difficult to imagine. Caesar had transformed the political landscape. His victories had demonstrated the power of a commander backed by loyal armies. His civil war had weakened republican institutions. His dictatorship had shown how much authority could be concentrated in one individual. His assassination had failed to restore the old political order. And his adopted heir inherited not only his name, but also the political loyalty attached to it. Caesar did not build the Roman Empire as it would later exist, but he helped create the conditions from which it emerged. There is another Caesar worth remembering. Not Caesar the commander, not Caesar the dictator, but Caesar the writer. His surviving works give us something rare. We can read words written by a man who lived more than 2,000 years ago and stood at the center of some of the most important events of his age. The commentaries on the Gallic War describe his campaigns in Gaul. The commentaries on the Civil War describe part of his conflict with Pompey and the senatorial forces. His Latin became famous for clarity. Generations of students have learned the language by reading Caesar. There is something almost strange about that survival. Caesar commanded tens of thousands of soldiers. Most of their names are lost. He captured towns that later changed names or disappeared. He negotiated with leaders whose lives survive only in fragments. Yet sentences written in his military camps continued to be copied. Centuries passed. The Roman Empire changed. Western imperial government collapsed. Latin evolved into other languages. Manuscripts crossed the Middle Ages. Printing appeared. Modern schools developed. And still, students encountered Caesar's description of Gaul. His military prose became part of his immortality. Of course, Caesar's writings must be read critically. He was explaining his own actions. He had reasons to make Roman intervention appear justified. He had reasons to emphasize the danger of enemies and the discipline of his own forces. He had reasons to present his decisions as rational. A modern historian does not simply accept every claim, but that does not make the writings less fascinating. In fact, it may make them more interesting. They allow us to encounter Caesar both as participant and narrator. He fought the war. Then he helped decide how the war would be remembered. Caesar's name also developed a life of its own. After his death and deification, his family name became associated with imperial authority. Augustus carried it. Later Roman rulers adopted it. Eventually, Caesar was no longer simply the surname of one aristocratic family. It became a title connected with rulership. Centuries later, words derived from Caesar appeared in other languages. The German Kaiser, the Russian Tsar or Tsar. Across enormous distances of time and geography, rulers borrowed a title descended from the name of a Roman who died in 44 before the Common Era. That alone would have astonished Caesar. His cultural afterlife became equally remarkable. Medieval writers knew him.
Dante included Caesar among the great figures of antiquity. Renaissance scholars studied his works. Painters imagined his victories and death. Political thinkers debated whether he had saved Rome or destroyed the Republic. Military commanders studied his campaigns. And in the late 16th century, William Shakespeare wrote the tragedy that would shape the popular image of Caesar for generations. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is not a documentary record of March 44 before the Common Era. It is a drama. Characters speak words created for the stage. Events are arranged for theatrical effect. But the play became so influential that its language sometimes feels more familiar than the ancient sources themselves. Beware the Ides of March. Et tu, Brute? Friends, Romans, countrymen. Those words belong to literature rather than a reliable transcript of Caesar's final days. Yet they show how history can become memory, and memory can become culture. A historical Caesar existed. Then generations created their own Caesars. The brilliant general, the ambitious tyrant, the reformer, the destroyer of liberty, the merciful victor, the ruthless conqueror, the master politician, the victim of betrayal, the founder of an imperial future. Different ages emphasized different versions. Perhaps no single version is enough. If we look back quietly across Caesar's life, one thing becomes clear. Almost nothing about his rise was inevitable. The young man who refused Sulla's order might have disappeared from history. The pirates who captured him might have changed his fate. An election might have gone differently. A military campaign might have failed. A battle in Gaul might have ended in defeat. Alesia might have fallen to the relief army. Pompey might have pressed his advantage after Dyrrhachium. Pharsalus might have ended differently. Caesar might have remained in Egypt too long. Munda might have been lost. The Senate might have reached a compromise with him before the Rubicon. He might have stayed home on the Ides of March. History looks orderly when viewed backward, because we know where it ends. Living through it would have felt very different. People made decisions without knowing the consequences. Caesar crossed the Rubicon without knowing that 2,000 years later, the river's name would become an expression for an irreversible choice. Brutus entered the conspiracy,
without knowing that his name would become permanently associated with betrayal. Octavian accepted Caesar's inheritance without knowing for certain that he would become Augustus. Cleopatra allied herself with Caesar without knowing that Roman civil war would eventually help bring an end to her dynasty. History was open. Then choices closed one path after another. Caesar's military reputation remains extraordinary. He understood movement. He understood logistics. He could inspire soldiers. He was willing to take risks that more cautious commanders avoided. He also made mistakes. At Gergovia, Roman forces were defeated. At Dyrrhachium, Pompey gained a significant victory. Caesar was not an unbeatable machine moving through history. His success depended on adapting when plans failed. His engineering operations were especially notable. Roman soldiers built fortified camps almost everywhere they stopped. They constructed roads. They dug trenches. They built bridges. They erected siege works. At Alesia, engineering became central to victory. At the Rhine, a bridge became a strategic message. When crossing waterways during civil war, speed and construction repeatedly allowed Caesar to appear where opponents did not expect him. But military skill alone does not explain his career. Rome had produced many brilliant generals. Caesar combined military command with unusual political ability. He remembered the importance of public opinion in Rome, even while campaigning hundreds of miles away. He maintained allies. He borrowed money. He rewarded supporters. He wrote about his campaigns. He used clemency strategically. He understood symbols. He could present himself as the defender of Roman rights, even while taking actions that pushed republican rules to their limits. That combination made him far more dangerous to his rivals than military talent alone. His political legacy remains difficult precisely because he cannot easily be placed into a simple category. Was Caesar trying from the beginning to destroy the Roman Republic? The evidence does not require us to imagine such a lifelong master plan. His early career took place within republican institutions. He sought traditional offices. He competed in elections. He formed alliances of the kind Roman aristocrats regularly formed, although his alliance with Pompey and Crassus became exceptionally powerful. His conflict with the Senate developed over years. His crossing of the Rubicon was a radical step, but it emerged from a specific political crisis over his command, legal security, and future career. After victory, however, the concentration of power became unmistakable. Dictator for life was not simply another ordinary republican office. His honors separated him from other senators. His repeated control of high offices reduced meaningful competition. His personal authority stood above institutions that had once depended on rivalry among many aristocrats. Even if Caesar did not intend to become a king in title, opponents could reasonably wonder whether the republic still functioned as a republic. At the same time, The old republic had been in crisis long before Caesar. Marius had held the consulship an unprecedented number of times. Sulla had marched armies on Rome. Sulla had become dictator and used violence against political enemies. Powerful generals had increasingly dominated politics. Street violence, bribery, disputed elections, and extraordinary military commands had already strained constitutional norms. Caesar did not create every weakness he exploited, nor did his death repair them. That may be the most important reason his story remains so compelling. Caesar was both a product of the Roman Republic's crisis and one of the people who drove that crisis toward a new form. He did not act alone, but he changed what became possible. Consider also the ordinary people around him. Most histories naturally focus on the famous names: Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, Cleopatra, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, Octavian. But behind every famous decision stood thousands or millions of less famous lives. Roman farmers whose sons joined the legions, veterans hoping for land, merchants waiting for stable trade, citizens depending on grain supplies, Gaulish families living in towns that became battlefields, people in Spain watching Roman armies fight one another, Alexandrians caught inside a dynastic struggle complicated by Roman intervention, senators uncertain which faction would control Rome next year, slaves whose labor supported wealthy households, scribes copying reports, sailors moving armies across the Mediterranean, engineers measuring ground for camps and fortifications, messengers riding with letters. History at Caesar's scale was never created by one man alone. A general could give an order, but tens of thousands of people made the order real. An administrator could announce a reform, but officials across distant territories had to implement it. A calendar could be changed in Rome, but communities throughout Roman territory had to begin counting their days differently. The name Caesar stands at the top of the story because ancient politics concentrated attention on elite men. But the world he changed was populated by people whose names usually disappeared from the record. Perhaps, as you listen quietly, there is something peaceful in remembering them too. Not every person has to become famous to have lived within history. Caesar's relationship with his soldiers deserves particular attention. Roman legionaries served for long periods under demanding conditions. They marched with heavy equipment. They built fortified camps. They fought far from home. They depended on commanders for leadership, rewards, and often future settlement. Caesar developed extraordinary loyalty among many of his troops. Ancient accounts preserve stories of soldiers enduring hardship for him, and of Caesar addressing them with carefully chosen words. He could be generous with rewards. After major victories, veterans received money and land. But the relationship was not always easy. During the civil wars, some of Caesar's soldiers mutinied after long service. One famous episode occurred when veterans demanded discharge and rewards.
Caesar addressed them not as fellow soldiers, but as citizens, implying that he accepted their departure and would continue without them. According to the traditional account, the change in wording affected them deeply. They wanted to remain soldiers of Caesar rather than become ordinary citizens again. The story may have been polished by later writers, as such stories often were. Still, it reflects a broader reality. Caesar understood identity. He understood the pride his troops took in belonging to his army, and he knew how to speak to that pride. This personal relationship between commander and troops was one of the forces changing the late Republic. In earlier Republican ideals, an army belonged to the state. In practice, late Republican soldiers could become attached to individual generals. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, later Antony, later Octavian. When political disagreements occurred, these commanders could possess military forces with personal loyalties. A republic based on civilian political competition became increasingly vulnerable when politicians also controlled armies willing to follow them against other Romans. The Rubicon was possible because Caesar's soldiers crossed it with him. Without them, it would have been only a man standing beside a small river. And what of Pompey? It is easy for Caesar's fame to reduce Pompey to the role of defeated rival. But before the Civil War, Pompey was arguably the more famous man. He had earned the title Magnus, the Great. He had achieved victories while still unusually young. He had received extraordinary commands. He cleared pirates from the Mediterranean with remarkable speed. He defeated Mithridates and reorganized Rome's territories in the east. He celebrated a magnificent triumph. His reputation was enormous. When Caesar arranged the first triumvirate, he was cooperating with a man who had already reached heights Caesar was still pursuing. Their partnership was therefore not simply a story of Pompey helping Caesar. Caesar helped Pompey achieve political goals that the Senate had delayed. Each needed the other. Over time, their positions changed. Caesar's victories in Gaul increased his stature. Pompey remained in Rome and became increasingly connected with senatorial conservatives. By the time of the Civil War, both sides claimed to be defending legitimate interests. Pompey had the support of many leading senators. Caesar claimed that his own rights and the rights of supportive tribunes had been violated. This is often how civil conflicts develop. Neither side describes itself as the destroyer of the system. Each presents itself as defending something essential. The tragedy is that the struggle to defend those things can destroy the system both sides claim to protect. Pompey's death in Egypt ended their personal rivalry, but it did not end the political forces that produced it. Cleopatra, too, can disappear behind the fame of Caesar. She should not. When Caesar met her, she was not merely a romantic figure entering a Roman story.
She was a monarch fighting to recover her throne. She belonged to a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. She was politically capable and highly educated. Her alliance with Caesar helped restore her position.
Later, after Caesar's death, her alliance with Antony became part of the final struggle for control of the Roman world. For Cleopatra, relationships with powerful Romans were connected with Egypt's survival in a Mediterranean increasingly dominated by Rome. For Caesar, Egypt offered wealth, strategic importance, and a politically valuable ally. Their personal relationship existed within those larger realities. Caesarion, their alleged son, represented another possible connection between the Ptolemaic monarchy and Caesar's name. But Rome's future would not belong to Caesarion. After Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, Caesarion was killed. Octavian would not tolerate a rival who could be presented as the biological son of Julius Caesar. The irony is striking. The young man Caesar adopted in his will became the founder of the Roman imperial system. The young man Cleopatra presented as Caesar's natural son did not survive its creation. One of the most tempting things to do with Caesar is to imagine what would have happened if he had lived. He was preparing a campaign against Parthia. Crassus had died disastrously fighting the Parthians in 53 before the Common Era. The loss at Carrhae remained a humiliation for Rome. Caesar apparently planned a major eastern expedition. Some ancient reports suggest broader ambitions extending toward Dacia and beyond. Had Caesar left Rome on schedule in March of 44, he might have been away for years. Would he have defeated Parthia? Would he have returned to Rome with even greater prestige? Would he have created a formal hereditary monarchy? Would the Senate have adapted to his permanent dominance? Would another military revolt have emerged? We cannot know. These questions belong to the realm of possibilities, not history. And it is important to keep that boundary clear. Caesar's assassination froze his political system before it fully developed. Augustus eventually created a much more durable solution. He learned, perhaps, from what had happened to his adoptive father. Augustus accumulated enormous power, but usually presented that power with greater respect for republican forms. He avoided the title of king. He avoided calling himself dictator. He preferred terms such as princeps, first citizen. Traditional offices continued. The Senate continued. Elections continued for a time. But behind the traditional appearance stood the authority of one man. Where Caesar's supremacy could appear open and confrontational, Augustus made monarchy-like power look more compatible with Roman tradition. It was an extraordinary political achievement. And perhaps it would have been impossible without the lesson of Caesar's death. Caesar's calendar reform may offer the gentlest way to understand his lasting influence. Imagine Rome before the reform. Officials needed the calendar for elections, festivals, legal matters, religious observances, and public administration. But the calendar had drifted away from the seasons. Adjustments were inconsistently applied. By Caesar's time,
The problem had become severe. The reform created what later Romans called the Julian calendar. To realign dates with the seasons, the transition required an unusually long year. Then the new system began. A solar year was treated as 365 days, with an extra day added every fourth year. The approximation was remarkably good. Not perfect, but remarkably good. The true solar year is slightly shorter than 365 1/4 days. Over many centuries, that small difference accumulated. By the 16th century, the calendar had drifted noticeably. Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian reform in 1582. The new rules altered the leap year system slightly. That Gregorian calendar eventually became the international civil calendar used across much of the world today. So our calendar is not simply Caesar's calendar unchanged, but it descends directly from the structure created in his time.
A decision made during the final years of the Roman Republic still shapes the rhythm of modern life. January, February, March, April, May, June, July. The name July quietly passes through our lives every year. People make appointments. Schools close for summer. Families travel. Businesses report quarterly results. Birthdays are celebrated. And almost no one thinks of a Roman dictator. But the name remains. Perhaps that is one of history's strangest forms of immortality. Not a statue, not a battlefield, just a page of the calendar. His name survives in language in another unexpected way. When later Roman emperors used Caesar as part of their titles, the word slowly became detached from the individual man. A personal name turned into an idea of imperial authority. Kaiser, Tsar. Words used by rulers separated from ancient Rome by many centuries. The historical Caesar could never have known the political worlds of medieval Germany or imperial Russia, yet his name traveled into them. Even the word Caesarism later developed to describe forms of strong personal rule associated with charismatic or military leadership. Again, the historical figure became a political concept. This process can make it difficult to see the original human being. The name grows larger than the life. So perhaps it is worth returning once more to the young Caesar, before the titles, before Gaul, before the Rubicon, before Cleopatra, before dictatorship. A young Roman whose father had died, a husband who refused Sulla's demand to abandon Cornelia, a junior officer serving far from Rome, a student traveling toward Rhodes, a prisoner of pirates, a lawyer trying to make his name in public speeches. At every stage, the later Caesar had not yet fully appeared. The legend was still being built, one choice at a time. Ancient historians often tried to explain great lives through character. Was Caesar ambitious? Clearly. Was he courageous? Frequently. Was he vain? Ancient writers certainly thought so. Was he generous? He could be extraordinarily generous. Was he ruthless? His campaigns provide ample evidence that he could be. Was he forgiving? Toward many Roman opponents, surprisingly so. These qualities do not cancel one another. Human beings are rarely built from a single trait. Caesar could pardon a political opponent and destroy a resisting community. He could respect Roman tradition in one moment and disregard it in another. He could write with calm precision about events he had helped create through enormous violence. He could reject a royal diadem while accepting dictatorship for life. He could appear confident enough to challenge every rival while still caring about public opinion. That complexity may explain why arguments about Caesar never fully end. If he were simply heroic, there would be little to debate. If he were simply tyrannical, there would be little to debate. Instead, his career contains achievements and warnings at the same time. He expanded Rome. He destabilized Rome. He reformed government. He concentrated power. He pardoned enemies. His conquests caused enormous suffering. He created order. His civil war destroyed order. His assassins killed him to save the Republic. Their action helped produce further wars that ensured the Republic never truly returned. History resists simplicity. More than 2,000 years later, the physical Rome of Caesar's lifetime is both present and absent. You can walk through Rome today and stand among the ruins of the Roman Forum. The shapes of temples and basilicas still rise from the ground. The Senate House, visible today, reflects a complex history of reconstruction, but the space still evokes the political world in which Caesar lived. The theater of Pompey itself has largely disappeared beneath later Rome, though the location remains part of the modern city. Roads follow ancient routes. Fragments of columns appear beside modern streets. Layers of history sit beneath churches, apartment buildings, restaurants, offices, and traffic. Caesar would not recognize the city. And yet certain names would be familiar. The Tiber still flows. The Capitol line still rises. The Forum remains. The Mediterranean still surrounds the lands through which Roman armies and merchants traveled. Gaul became France and neighboring countries. Roman Britain became part of a very different historical world. Alexandria remains a great Egyptian city, though transformed many times. The locations survive even when the civilizations around them change. Perhaps that is another reason ancient history can feel calming at night. It reminds us that human lives are brief. Political crises pass. Cities change. And yet rivers continue toward the sea. Caesar lived for roughly 55 years. That is not a very long life by modern standards. Yet those years contained several distinct lives. The young aristocrat threatened by Sulla, the soldier, the advocate, the ambitious politician, the debtor financing public popularity, the chief priest, the governor in Spain,
the consul, the partner of Pompey and Crassus, the conqueror in Gaul, the commander who crossed the Rhine, the first Roman general to campaign in Britain, the victor at Alesia, the rebel crossing the Rubicon, the enemy of Pompey, the victor at Pharsalus, the ally of Cleopatra, the conqueror at Zela, the dictator, the reformer, the man preparing another distant campaign, and finally, the figure whose death on the Ides of March became more famous than almost any other political assassination in ancient history. When compressed into a list, it seems almost impossible. But lives do not occur as lists. They unfold slowly, one morning after another. A journey, a conversation, an election, a letter, a winter camp, a march, a decision, a victory, a mistake, another decision. Only later does someone connect the moments and call them a life. Perhaps the quietest lesson in Caesar's story concerns the limits of control. Caesar spent much of his career gaining control. Control of his finances, control of political alliances, control of armies, control of provinces, control of Gaul, control of Rome. He learned to move faster than opponents. He learned to manage public opinion. He learned to defeat armies. He learned to forgive some enemies and remove others. By early 44 before the Common Era, he had reached a position almost no Roman before him had possessed, and still he could not control everything. He could not know exactly what senators whispered when he left a room. He could not make every aristocrat accept permanent subordination. He could not guarantee that clemency would create loyalty. He could not know whether every honor made him stronger or simply made resentment deeper. He could not know the future. No one can. That may be the point where an ancient life feels unexpectedly modern. Technology changes, governments change, language changes, but uncertainty remains. People plan, people choose, people hope. Events move in directions no one expected, and history emerges afterward. The assassins believed Caesar's death would restore liberty. Instead, Rome entered another period of civil war. Caesar's heir eventually became Rome's first emperor. That outcome does not mean the conspirators were insincere, nor does it mean Caesar's dictatorship was inevitably necessary. It means that political systems are more complicated than individual people. Removing one person does not automatically restore institutions that have been weakened for decades. The Roman Republic had depended upon traditions of competition, compromise, limited terms of office, and shared aristocratic expectations. By Caesar's lifetime, many of those expectations had already been damaged. Powerful generals had armies. Political violence had become familiar. Extraordinary commands had become common. Economic inequality had created tension. Provincial expansion had transformed the scale of government. Caesar accelerated the transformation, but the forces were larger than Caesar. When he died, they remained. Octavian understood them, and eventually he mastered them. Caesar's image after death changed with the needs of later generations. For some, he represented military genius. For others, political ambition. For monarchs, he could represent legitimate universal rule. For republicans, he could represent the danger of concentrated power. For writers, his assassination provided a perfect drama of friendship, loyalty, fear, principle, and betrayal. For military historians, Alicia offered a case study in siege warfare. For students of politics, the first triumvirate showed how informal alliances can dominate formal institutions. For students of communication, Caesar's commentaries demonstrated the power of controlling one's own narrative. For anyone looking at a calendar, July provided a quiet reminder that even administrative reforms can outlive military victories. There is no single Caesar, because every generation asks different questions. But behind all those interpretations remains the historical outline. A Roman aristocrat born around 100 before the Common Era. A career formed during the violent final decades of the Republic. A commander who conquered Gaul. A politician who built an alliance with Pompey and Crassus. A general who refused to surrender his command and crossed the Rubicon. A victor in civil war. A ruler who accumulated unprecedented authority. A reformer who changed the calendar. A dictator for life. And a man killed by senators on March 15th, 44 before the Common Era. Those facts provide the frame. Everything else is the long conversation history has carried on around them. And now, after traveling through so many years, we can allow the story to become quieter. The armies have stopped marching. The crowds of the Forum have faded. The speeches are finished. The Senate chamber is silent. The ships crossing the Mediterranean have disappeared beyond the horizon. The Roman camps in Gaul have returned to the earth. Alicia has become an archaeological landscape. The Rubicon continues toward the Adriatic, although even the precise identification of the ancient river became a question for later generations. Alexandria looks across a Mediterranean that has seen empire after empire come and go. Rome itself continues. Different languages are spoken. Different governments rule. Different buildings stand. Yet Caesar's name remains. On books, on monuments, in plays, in political language, in the word Kaiser, in the word Tsar, and quietly, every summer, in the name July. Julius Caesar did not live to see the Roman Empire formally emerge. He never saw Augustus create a political order that would endure for centuries. He never knew that school children thousands of years later would learn about the Rubicon. He never knew that his Latin prose would survive. He never knew that Shakespeare would place imagined words in his mouth. He never knew that the date of his death
would become a phrase recognized throughout the world. He simply lived forward, as everyone does, one day at a time, and the legend came afterward. If there is one final image worth keeping, perhaps it is not the battlefield, not the assassination, not the triumphal procession. Imagine instead a manuscript, words copied carefully from one generation to another. The writer has been gone for centuries. The armies are gone. The Republic is gone. Even the Roman Empire that followed it has changed beyond recognition. But the words remain. A reader opens the text, and Caesar speaks again. Not literally, of course, but through the strange persistence of history. A human thought crosses 2,000 years. That may be one of the quiet wonders of studying the past. The people are gone. Their world has changed. But fragments remain. A name, a sentence, a coin, a road, a calendar, a ruined wall. Enough pieces for us to sit quietly centuries later and listen to their story. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. There is no need to remember every date, no need to remember every battle, no need to remember every Roman name. The details can simply drift away. What remains is the broad shape of a life. A young aristocrat growing up in an unstable republic, a politician climbing through its offices, a commander traveling far beyond Rome, a conqueror returning with extraordinary power, a political system struggling to contain him, a final attempt by senators to turn history backward, and a world that instead moved forward into something new. The Roman Republic faded. The age of Augustus began. And somewhere between those two worlds stands Julius Caesar, general, politician, objectator, ramifications, reformer, conqueror, and one of the most influential figures of ancient history. For more than 2,000 years, people have continued to ask what he wanted, what he achieved, what he destroyed, and what might have happened if he had lived. Those questions will probably continue, but for tonight, there is no need to answer them. The story has reached its end. Ancient Rome can slowly fade into the distance. And if your thoughts have already begun to wander, you can simply let them wander. If you have missed a few words, that is perfectly fine. If you have missed many of them, that is perfectly fine too. The streets of Rome are quiet now. The torches have burned low. The voices of the Forum have disappeared. The river moves through the darkness, and more than 2,000 years after Caesar's time, his story can finally become quiet again. For tonight, we can leave ancient Rome there and let history slowly drift away.